Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are unpacking a really fascinating theological and historical question, one that actually surfaces every single year right around late spring. I mean, if you spend any time on social media, you've almost certainly seen the trend, right? People posting pictures of fire, doves, maybe some red vestments, all wishing the church a happy birthday on Pentecost Sunday. It's a wildly popular phrase, and honestly, on the surface, it makes total sense. But today, we're going to look at the actual source material and the historical roots to see if that popular phrase actually holds up. So, is this actually accurate? Was the church really born or, invented on that specific day in the upper room in the book of Acts? Or is it possible that something much deeper, much older, and honestly vastly more profound occurred? By looking closely at the ancient roots of this event, we're going to see that calling it a simple birthday might actually be missing the true majesty of what Pentecost really is. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. The 3 layers of Pentecost, peeling back the Jewish roots. To really grasp the massive paradigm shift of this event, we have to recognize that Pentecost wasn't originally a Christian feast at all. It's actually an ancient Jewish one. In fact, in the book of Acts, the whole reason thousands of people were gathered in Jerusalem in the first place was to celebrate it. We're going to peel back 3 specific historical layers that serve as our structural roadmap here. Number 1, the harvest. Number 2, the Exodus. And number 3, the prophecy. Each of these layers literally stacks right on top of the other, perfectly setting the stage for what happens to the apostles. Let's start with that first layer, the harvest. So, in the ancient Jewish agricultural cycle, the very first crop to spring up was barley. They'd celebrate the Feast of First Fruits by cutting that first spring barley and offering it to God in thanksgiving. Now, exactly 50 days later, and by the way, the word Pentecost literally means 50th, they celebrated the full wheat harvest. They would take that fully grown wheat, harvest it, and actually bake it into loaves. And wow, this brilliantly illustrates the New Testament imagery we see later on. I mean, think about the apostles in that upper room. They are basically the harvest of Christ's ministry. And what happens on Pentecost? Fire comes down on their heads. That fire beautifully, symbolically bakes the natural wheat of the apostles into the loaves of the Eucharistic Church. It's taking that raw, natural harvest and completely transforming it into something that can feed the entire world. All right, let's move to the second layer, the Exodus. Over time, the Jewish people layered a historical commemoration right onto this agricultural harvest. Exactly 50 days after the Passover, which is when the Israelites left Egypt, they arrived at Mount Sinai, and there, God gave them the 10 Commandments on stone. Now, we usually think of this law as just arbitrary rules, right? But the source material actually compares this law on stone to a loving car manual. Think of it like this. The manufacturer who built you is giving you the exact guide to your own happiness. If you put oil in the gas tank, the car breaks. If you sin, well, your life breaks. But there was a catch. A car manual is exterior to you. The law on stone was outside the human person. And that brings us to our third layer, the prophecy. This originates from the time of the Babylonian exile, where the prophet Jeremiah gives us this absolutely incredible promise. He says, "I will put my law within them, and I will write it upon their hearts." See, God's ultimate plan wasn't just to hand humanity a rule book carved on cold stone. No way. His plan was to place that law, his divine will, his divine love, intimately inside the human heart. Which brings us to section 2, the restoration, not an invention. When the Holy Spirit descends on the apostles in the book of Acts, it is this breathtaking restoration of humanity back to God's original plan. It's fulfilling the harvest, the law, and the prophecy all at once. Therefore, Pentecost is definitely not the invention or the birthday of the church out of nowhere. To truly understand this restoration, we have to look at a concept known in Eastern theology as theosis. Theosis essentially means partaking in the divine nature. The source points out that when you're baptized, the original Greek word used literally means to be plunged into Christ. You aren't just given a fancy title. You are plunged into the very life of God. Just like having a human nature lets you act human, partaking in the divine nature literally allows you to act like God. And how does God act? Well, as the Apostle John tells us, God is love. Theosis is the profound reality of participating in God's selfless love. Moving on to section 3, the eternal church, the divine communion. Now, this pivots our understanding significantly. If the church is about being plunged into the life of God, then we have to pull back our timeline. far, far before the book of Acts, way before the upper room. To find the true origin of the church, we literally have to look into eternity. Now, what's really interesting about this next quote is how it shifts that eternal perspective. We look to this profound statement from St. Porphyrios. The three persons of the Holy Trinity constitute the eternal church. Think about that. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit have lived in a perfect, loving communion from all eternity. That eternal exchange of love, that perfect communion, that is the eternal church. Unpacking this completely dismantles the whole birthday myth, because it's rooted in the very nature of the Trinity. The church is a divine, uncreated institution that actually existed before creation itself. The church was not some medieval invention. It wasn't even a New Testament invention. The church is God's eternal communion of love, which was meant for us before the very foundation of the world. Pentecost is simply the moment humanity is fully invited and restored into that pre-existing communion, right here on earth. The Apostle Paul perfectly understood this mind-bending reality, though, to be fair, he learned it the hard way. Think of his dramatic conversion story on the road to Damascus. He's knocked to the ground by this blinding light, and Christ asks him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Notice Jesus doesn't say, "Why are you persecuting my followers?" or "Why are you persecuting my new organization?" He says, "Me." In that flash, Paul realized that Christians are literally united with Christ. They make up the living stones of his eternal living temple. And that brings us to section 4, a life of thanksgiving, the sacramental thank you. Let's bring this lofty eternal theology back down to earth for a second. If the church is an eternal communion of divine love, and if Pentecost is the exact moment the Holy Spirit restores our ability to actually participate in that love, how on earth are we supposed to respond? Seriously, when you are invited into an eternal, divine community, what do you actually do?
Well, the answer is surprisingly simple, and it's rooted right in the vocabulary of the early Christians. The word Eucharist is a Greek word that literally means thanksgiving. When you realize the absolute magnitude of the gift you've been given, that you've been plunged into the very life of the Trinity, the only logical proper response is to simply say thank you. The divine liturgy, the worship of the church, it isn't just some chore or obligation. It's our grateful response to being plunged into the Trinity.
We can see how this builds into our daily spiritual lives through the sacraments. The source provides this brilliant marriage analogy. In a marriage, a husband doesn't just say "I love you" on the wedding day and then never ever say it again. He says it 100,000 times, in 100,000 different ways, by holding his wife's hand, through acts of service, through kind words. God operates exactly the same way. The 7 sacraments are like the physical arteries of the church, constantly pumping God's "I love you" into us throughout our entire lives. Which brings us to our final thought. We've seen today that Pentecost is vastly more than just a simple birthday. It's the absolute fulfillment of ancient harvests and prophecies. It's the restoration of humanity. It is the moment the Holy Spirit was given so that you and I could actually participate in the eternal, loving communion of the Trinity. God has spent thousands of years, through harvests and laws and prophets, preparing to pour his eternal love directly into your heart. So the question I want to leave you with today is this: how will you say thank you to an eternal gift?